My name is Genevieve Mercer, and I am 28 years old. 5 years ago, at our annual family reunion, my uncle climbed onto a cedar picnic table and made a $10,000 public bet that I would be a failure for the rest of my life. 12 of my own relatives threw cash into a glass jar to seal the wager, while my parents stood by and nodded. What none of them knew was that I wrote the date of their joke on a grease-stained napkin and carried it in my wallet for 4 years and 11 months. They also did not know that my grandfather had been watching them too, and he left a legal trap that would let me buy the land right out from under their feet. Before I tell you what happened when they threw a party to collect their winnings, please subscribe to Orange Vengeance and let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments. The August heat in Texas does not just warm you, it presses down on your shoulders like a physical weight. Mesquite smoke drifted across the sprawling lawn of the Mercer family ranch, carrying the scent of charred brisket and spilled beer. I was 23 years old, sitting in the shade of a live oak tree, with my laptop resting on my knees. I was trying to debug a neural network model. The screen brightness was turned all the way up to fight the glare, draining my battery just as fast as my family drained my patience. Genevieve closed the screen and joined the real world. The voice belonged to Uncle Vance. He stood on top of the main picnic table with a silver belt buckle gleaming at his waist. He held a wide-mouthed glass jar high in the air. The chatter of 50 relatives died down. Vance thrived on an audience. He built strip malls, bought cheap land, and believed a person's worth was measured entirely in acreage. "I am putting money on the table right now," Vance said, projecting his voice so the cousins by the horseshoe pit would hear. He pulled a crisp $100 bill from his money clip and dropped it into the jar. "Our little computer genius here is 23, still living in that tiny apartment, still typing away for pennies. I say 5 years from today she is still renting. She will never own a single square foot of Texas dirt." Laughter rippled through the yard, not the warm, teasing kind. It was the sharp, biting sound of a family that had already decided who the loser was. My older sister Savannah stepped up to the table. She pushed her designer sunglasses back on her blonde hair, smiled a camera-ready grin, and dropped $300 bills into the jar. "I am an Uncle Vance. Easy money." They passed the jar around. Cousins, aunts, and uncles reached into their pockets. Crisp bills drifted to the bottom. I watched the cash pile up. My fingers hovered over my keyboard. I looked toward the patio, searching for the 2 people who were supposed to step in and defend me. My mother, Linda, stood by the cooler. She took a slow sip of her sweet tea, keeping her eyes focused intently on the condensation running down the side of her glass. She did not say a word. Beside her, my father, Thomas, wiped barbecue sauce from his chin with a paper towel. He caught my eye, offered a half-hearted shrug, and spoke loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Honestly, Vance is probably right. A hot flush crept up my neck, but I locked my jaw. Crying in front of Vance was like throwing blood in the water. I closed my laptop with a quiet click. I did not yell. I did not storm off. I reached for a napkin sitting on the edge of my chair. It was stained with a thumbprint of grease from a brisket sandwich. I pulled a pen from my bag. In careful block letters, I wrote down the date. Beneath it, I wrote the number 10,000. That was the figure Vance had just shouted to the crowd, the collective bounty placed on my failure. I folded the napkin twice, pressing the creases sharp, and slipped it into the leather slot of my wallet. I stood up, met Vance's gaze, and offered a tight, clinical smile. The countdown had started. 4 years and 11 months later, a certified letter from my grandfather's estate attorney arrived on my desk, and the date printed at the top of the page was the exact same date I had written on that napkin. The hum of cooling fans served as the constant grinding soundtrack to my life. My apartment was a 400-square-foot studio wedged beside Interstate 35 in Austin. It vibrated every time a commercial semi-truck rumbled past the thin drywall. August had returned to Central Texas, baking the concrete outside and turning my living room into a stagnant, suffocating sauna. I sat cross-legged on a faded floral thrift store sofa, balancing a 5-year-old laptop held together by overlapping strips of silver duct tape across the cracked hinges. A box fan rattled unsteadily in the window frame, pushing hot air around, doing nothing to cool the array of external hard drives stacked precariously on a plastic milk crate. I was 28 years old, scraping by as a freelance artificial intelligence data scientist, pouring my youth into lines of code. I was also exactly 29 days away from the 5-year deadline of Uncle Vance's public wager. On my screen, dense blocks of Python code scrolled in a blur of neon green against the black terminal background. I was training a predictive machine learning algorithm for a corporate client based in Dallas. The model was built to analyze decades of commercial real estate records identifying undervalued lots hidden within shifting zoning districts. If the code compiled correctly, and if tomorrow morning's pitch succeeded, the resulting contract would alter the trajectory of my career. It was the kind of high-stakes hustle that demanded grueling 80-hour workweeks, forcing me to stare at raw datasets until my vision blurred and my temples pulsed with a dull ache. My parents never saw the 80 hours. They only saw a girl sitting in the dark staring at a screen. My entire life I watched Uncle Vance and my father measure success by acreage and concrete. They bought land. They built strip malls. They judged anyone who did not have dirt under their fingernails or a deed in a safe. I chose a different path. I learned to read the data beneath the dirt. I saw zoning shifts before the city council even voted. I tracked demographic migrations through cell tower pings and credit card transactions. My algorithms could predict a neighborhood's commercial value 5 years before a developer even looked at a map. But to a family of old-school Texas real estate men, data was not real work. It was invisible, and by extension so was I. My phone buzzed on the scarred wood of the coffee table, vibrating against an empty mug. The screen lit up with a text message from my older sister Savannah. I did not want to look, but the glow caught my eye. Just closed. So exhausted from signing papers all morning. You should see the backyard. Attached was a high-resolution photo of Savannah standing on the manicured emerald lawn of a 4-bedroom brick traditional in a gated Austin suburb. She held up a set of shiny brass keys, her teeth blindingly white, her posture screaming effortless triumph. I stared at the image, feeling the familiar hollow ache settling deep in my chest. Savannah had not achieved that milestone through late nights or relentless effort. 3 weeks ago, we had all met for a celebratory dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I had arrived late, smelling of stale coffee and printer ozone, having just finished a punishing coding sprint for a minor client. My parents had already ordered a bottle of champagne. Before the appetizers even reached the table, my father Thomas reached into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the crisp white tablecloth directly into Savannah's manicured hands. "A little push to get you over the finish line, sweetie," he had said, puffing out his chest with paternal pride, ignoring the fact that I was sitting right next to her. 50,000. That should cover the down payment and leave some room for new furniture. Savannah had squealed, throwing her arms around his neck, oblivious to the sting of the moment. I had sat there gripping my condensation-slicked water glass. When I quietly mentioned that I was close to securing a major tech contract and could use a minor short-term loan to upgrade my failing servers, my mother Linda waved a dismissive hand in my direction. "Genevieve, please." She sighed, swirling her wine, treating my life's work like a childish hobby. "Savannah is making real investments. She is building a future. You are still playing on the computer. When you decide to get a real job, we can talk. But right now, we need to focus on your sister's future." My mother's condescending tone echoed in my head as I looked back at Savannah's text message. A second message popped up underneath the photo of the house. "Cannot wait to host the family barbecue next month. Uncle Vance says he is bringing the jar. Hope you are ready." She ended the message with a winking emoji. The countdown, the subtle twisting reminder. They had not forgotten the bet. They were eagerly polishing the stage for my failure, preparing to collect their winnings. I set the phone face down. The temptation to hurl the device across the room flared hot and bright, but I forced the anger down. Emotion was a luxury I could not afford. Data was the only currency that mattered. I turned my attention back to the duct-taped laptop, forcing myself to focus. The predictive model was entering its final epoch of training. It was an elegant, razor-sharp, and resource-heavy algorithm. It required vast amounts of processing power, pushing my makeshift rig to its limit. Suddenly, the cooling fan inside my laptop shrieked. A high-pitched grinding whine filled the cramped studio. On the screen, the scrolling green text stuttered. The progress bar froze at 98%. My pulse spiked. I muttered a quiet plea under my breath, my fingers flying across the keys. The terminal threw a fatal error code, memory allocation failure. The secondary server, a repurposed bulky gaming tower tucked beneath my desk, had overheated. If the system crashed now, the corrupted data cache would erase 4 days of continuous processing. The corporate pitch was scheduled for tomorrow morning. There was no time to restart the sequence. The 7-figure opportunity would evaporate, leaving me with nothing but a fried motherboard and a broken promise to myself. I dropped to the floor, my knees hitting the peeling linoleum. I yanked the side panel off the tower. A wave of trapped, blistering heat hit my face. The internal fans were choked with gray dust, struggling to spin. I grabbed a can of compressed air from my desk drawer and blasted the heat sinks, coughing as a cloud of debris billowed into the stagnant room. Back at the keyboard, I opened a secure shell interface, frantically typing commands to bypass the failing hardware node. My fingers moved with precise practice speed, rerouting the active processes to a cloud cluster I rented by the hour. I had to force the overloaded local memory to dump its cache and push the final data packets through the external pipeline before the entire system collapsed. The heat radiating from the tower burned my shins. I typed a manual override protocol, forcing the CPU to ignore temperature warnings. It was a dangerous gamble. If the processors melted, the hard drives could corrupt entirely. I was risking everything I owned on a single string of commands. The screen hung frozen in a terrifying stillness. The silence in the apartment stretched heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant wailing siren of an ambulance on the interstate. I held my breath, watching the blinking cursor. The progress bar flickered. 98.2%, 98.5%. The fan sounded like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. The plastic casing of the laptop grew hot enough to scald my palms. I did not pull away. I kept typing, pushing the data stream through the narrow bandwidth bottleneck. 99%. A warning light flashed red on the external drive array. I ignored it. I kept my eyes locked on the terminal window. I thought about the glass jar full of $100 bills. I thought about Savannah's shiny brass keys. I thought about my mother telling me to get a real job. The progress bar inched forward. 99.8. The screen flickered black for a terrifying fraction of a second. My heart stopped. Then the terminal returned. A single line of text appeared at the bottom of the screen. Process completed successfully. Output generated and secured. I slumped back against the thrift store sofa cushions, blowing out a long, ragged breath. Sweat plastered my cotton shirt to my spine. My hands shook from the adrenaline crash. The model had compiled. The pitch was saved. The data set I had just generated and safely stored in the cloud was worth more than Savannah's brand new suburban house. But to the family, I was still the girl sitting in a sweltering apartment with a broken computer trying to pretend I belonged in their world. I did not want to belong in their world. I wanted to buy it and remodel it. I reached for my plastic water bottle, my hands trembling so hard I could barely unscrew the cap. The water was lukewarm, but it felt like ice sliding down my dry throat. The crisis was over. The presentation was secure. I had survived another day of walking on a tightrope without a net. Right as I set the water bottle down, my cell phone vibrated against the table again. I flinched, expecting another taunting, passive-aggressive message from my sister, or perhaps a reminder from my mother about the upcoming barbecue. Instead, the screen illuminated with an incoming call. The caller identification was blank. Just one word glowed in the dim light of my apartment: restricted. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the red decline button. Nobody called this late unless it was a telemarketer or trouble. But an inexplicable instinct, a subtle shift in the heavy Texas air, compelled me to wait. The technological crisis had ended, but a deeply personal one was about to begin. I swiped the green icon and lifted the phone to my ear. The voice on the other end of the line was crisp and carried the hurried cadence of a man who measured his time in billable seconds. I held the phone tight against my ear, listening to the sounds of a bustling Dallas boardroom in the background. The caller identified himself as Marcus Thorne, the lead acquisitions director for the corporate client I had been courting for 6 months. I braced myself, expecting him to cancel tomorrow morning's pitch due to the erratic data stream I had just forced through my overheating servers. Instead, his next words shifted the foundation of my entire life. He told me his analytics team had unpacked the raw data packets I pushed to their secure cloud. They did not want to wait for a formal presentation. The predictive model I built had identified a hidden string of undervalued commercial zoning districts that their own internal engineers had missed entirely. My algorithm was flawless. Marcus Thorne did not offer me a chance to pitch. He offered me a 12-month exclusivity retainer on the spot. The figure he stated over the phone was a 7-figure sum. It was enough money to buy Savannah's pristine suburban house twice over in cash. I sat on my faded thrift store sofa, staring at the cracked linoleum floor, while the adrenaline slowly drained from my veins. I kept my voice level and professional, negotiating the final terms without letting a single tremor betray the fact that I was sitting in a sweltering apartment, smelling of burnt dust and stale coffee. When the call ended, I lowered the phone to my lap. The silence in my cramped studio felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of a struggling freelancer. It was the breathless quiet of a hunter who had just secured the catch of a lifetime. Within 48 hours, I hired a registered agent to file the corporate paperwork, shielding my identity behind layers of strict privacy clauses. I named the firm Lone Star Analytics. I opened commercial banking accounts, routed through a discreet legal firm in Austin, ensuring my name would never appear on a public registry. The initial deposit cleared 3 days later. The psychological toll of that secret weighed on me heavier than the Texas humidity. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to take a screenshot of my banking application and send it to my sister. I wanted to print the corporate contract and nail it to Uncle Vance's front door. The desire to brag, to force them to choke on their years of cruel jokes, burned bright and hot in my chest. But I knew my family. I knew the exact mechanics of their greed. If I arrived at the next Sunday dinner wearing designer clothes or driving a luxury vehicle, the mockery would vanish and the parasitism would begin. My parents would suddenly expect me to pay off the mortgage on Savannah's house under the guise of family duty. Uncle Vance would demand aggressive seed funding for his risky strip mall developments, claiming he was the one who motivated me to succeed. If they knew I had money, I would no longer be the family joke. I would become the family bank. I chose the harder path. I chose to stay entirely invisible. I celebrated my first $1 million milestone on a humid Tuesday night at a brightly lit gas station off the interstate frontage road. The neon signs buzzed overhead, casting a harsh yellow glare across the cracked concrete parking lot. I sat behind the wheel of my 10-year-old sedan, listening to the faint rattle of the failing exhaust pipe. I bought a $2 cup of bitter black coffee in a flimsy paper cup. I rested my phone against the worn plastic of the steering wheel and opened my secure banking application. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. The balance displayed a 1 followed by 6 bold zeros. I sat there sipping the cheap roasted coffee, letting the stark contrast between my immense new wealth and my humble reality ground me. I did not need a sprawling mansion to validate my worth. The glowing numbers on my screen were all the validation I required. The serene quiet of my private celebration broke when my phone vibrated, buzzing against the dashboard. The screen switched from my bank balance to an incoming call from my mother. I took a slow breath, burying the tech executive and summoning the struggling daughter. I answered the call, keeping my tone light and deferential. My mother did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I had eaten dinner or if my computer was running properly. She launched straight into a breathless monologue about Uncle Vance. "Your uncle is making incredible moves, Genevieve," she said, her voice thick with admiration. "He is acquiring commercial lots all throughout downtown Austin. He secured a huge bridge loan, and he is buying up the entire historic block near the river. It is a brilliant strategy. He is showing everyone what real Texas success looks like. I bit the inside of my cheek, tasting copper. I knew those downtown lots. My algorithm had analyzed those exact parcels of land 3 weeks ago. The zoning laws were scheduled to change quietly, restricting commercial development and crippling the property values. Uncle Vance was not making a brilliant move. He was walking blindfolded into a financial bear trap, buying bad debt at a premium price. But I could not tell my mother that. I could not warn them without revealing my software and my expertise. You should really ask Vance for a job answering phones at his new management office. She continued, her tone dripping with casual condescension. You need a steady paycheck, Genevieve. You know the family reunion is only a few weeks away. Vance is planning a huge spectacle to collect his winnings. I hope you have been saving your pennies to pay your end of the bet. It would be a shame for you to embarrass the family by backing out now. I stared through the windshield at the flickering neon gas station sign. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but my voice remained perfectly flat and agreeable. Do not worry, Mom, I replied. I am preparing for the barbecue. I will have everything settled. She offered a satisfied hum and hung up without saying goodbye. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The phrase my mother used echoed in the cramped space of my car. Real Texas success. Listening to her praise Vance's loud, arrogant boasting made my chest ache with a sudden vivid memory. There was only one man in the Mercer family who despised that kind of empty noise, my grandpa Silas. Silas was a man of worn leather boots and quiet observation. He never raised his voice. He never bragged about his cattle or his land. He used to sit on the wide wooden porch of his ranch, sipping unsweetened tea, watching Uncle Vance run his mouth at family gatherings. The rest of the family treated Vance like a king, but Silas always looked at him with a mixture of pity and quiet disdain. More importantly, Silas was the only person who ever truly saw me. When my parents ignored my high school science fair victories to celebrate Savannah joining the cheerleading squad, Silas was the one who stood by my presentation board asking detailed questions about my coding projects. He understood the profound value of moving in silence. The scent of the gas station coffee faded, replaced by a strong memory of peppermint and motor oil, the scent that always clung to my grandfather's denim jacket. I closed my eyes, remembering a specific afternoon in his dusty workshop. That memory contained a secret conversation, a quiet alliance forged in the shadows of my family's ignorance. It was a memory that held the key to everything that was about to unfold. The scent of stale roasted coffee in my car slowly gave way to a distinct memory of cedar smoke and roasted pecans. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, letting the humid night fade as my mind drifted back 3 years to a crisp November afternoon. It was the annual Mercer Thanksgiving dinner hosted at the sprawling ranch owned by my grandfather Silas. Silas was a man carved directly from Texas limestone. He favored silence over chatter. He wore faded denim and boots scuffed from actual labor, contrasting sharply with the tailored suits and pristine cowboy hats my father and uncle paraded around in. Silas never demanded attention, but the room always quieted when he walked in. That particular Thanksgiving, the dining room felt like a battlefield of egos. Uncle Vance sat near the center of the long mahogany table, carving the smoked turkey, while simultaneously carving up the reputations of anyone who dared to live differently than he did. The crystal glasses clinked, and the wine flowed, loosening tongues and dropping inhibitions. I sat at the far end of the table, keeping my eyes focused on my plate, hoping to remain invisible. My strategy failed when Vance pointed the carving knife in my direction. He offered a wide, predatory grin that showcased his expensive dental veneers. So Genevieve Vance projected his voice, ensuring the entire room halted their side conversations. How is that little data gig treating you? Still typing code for pennies while the rest of us are doing real business. I hear you are still renting that tiny box by the highway. When are you going to step up and buy a piece of the world? My sister Savannah let out a sharp laugh, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. My mother Linda reached for her wineglass, offering a tight smile, but zero defense. My father Thomas stared at his mashed potatoes, unwilling to contradict his brother. The table fell silent, waiting for me to react. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my jaw locked. From the head of the table, Silas set his heavy silver fork down. The soft clink echoed in the quiet room. He did not raise his voice. He did not reprimand Vance. He simply looked at me with clear, steady eyes. "Genevieve, grab your coat," Silas said, standing up from his chair. "We have a broken fence post on the north ridge that needs tending. The turkey can wait." Vance scoffed, muttering something about a waste of time, but he did not dare challenge the patriarch of the family. I pushed my chair back and followed my grandfather out the back door, leaving the suffocating heat of the dining room behind. The November air was biting and sharp, carrying the scent of dry earth and impending frost. We walked in silence toward his dusty wooden workshop. Silas did not offer pity or empty comfort. He understood that sympathy was just another form of weakness in our family. Instead, he handed me a pair of thick leather work gloves and a heavy iron post hole digger. We drove his battered pickup truck to the edge of the property where a cedar post had rotted through at the base. Silas instructed me on how to clear the dirt, showing me how to use the leverage of the iron tool to break the hard clay. We worked side by side until my breath formed white clouds in the chill and my muscles ached with the effort. Once the new post was set and we were pouring the quick-setting concrete, Silas leaned against the tailgate of his truck. He pulled a worn, leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket. He flipped through the pages, revealing columns of meticulous handwritten numbers and dates. "Do not let the noise in that dining room distract you, Genevieve," he said, his voice rumbling low and steady. "Your Uncle Vance talks a big game, but his foundations are rotting just like that old fence post. He is over-leveraged. He takes out high-interest loans to pay off older debts. Your father follows right behind him, blinded by the flash. Savannah buys houses on credit she cannot sustain. They are loud because they are hollow." Silas tapped the leather notebook against his palm. I watch them. I track the missteps. They think I am just an old man who does not understand modern business. But math does not change just because you wear a nicer suit. He walked over to the newly set post, resting his rough hand on the solid wood. "Talkers do not build, Genevieve. You remember that. Let them run their mouths. Let them think you are weak. You keep working in the quiet. You keep saving. Let them run their mouths while you buy the land beneath their feet." He saw me. He saw the 80-hour work weeks, the relentless coding, the silent ambition that the rest of the family dismissed. In that moment, standing on the cold Texas dirt, I realized I was not alone. I had a mentor who understood the power of invisibility. That philosophy became the bedrock of my survival. The memory was so vivid, I could almost feel the rough leather of the work gloves on my hands. I sat in my car at the gas station, drawing strength from my grandfather's words. Then the harsh ringtone of my cell phone shattered the recollection. The sudden noise jerked me back to the present. The caller identification displayed my father's name. It was past midnight. Thomas never called this late. A cold sense of dread pooled in my stomach as I accepted the call. "Genevieve," my father said. His voice lacked its usual arrogant cadence. It sounded thin and hollow, stripped of all pretense. "What is wrong?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel. "It is your grandfather," Thomas replied, a slight tremor breaking his words. "He collapsed on the porch an hour ago. The paramedics tried to revive him, but his heart gave out. He is gone." The neon lights of the gas station blurred into streaks of harsh yellow. The air in my car turned instantly freezing. My chest tightened as the devastating reality settled over me. Silas was gone. The quiet rancher with the leather notebook, the only person in the Mercer bloodline who believed in my potential, was dead. The grief was a heavy, smothering blanket. It isolated me entirely. I was now adrift in a sea of predators without my singular anchor. I ended the call and rested my forehead against the steering wheel, allowing the tears to fall in the privacy of my dark car. There would be no more quiet lessons by the fence line. I was truly on my own. 4 days later, the Mercer family gathered at the local cemetery under a punishing midday sun. The weather offered no reprieve, trapping the heat beneath the dark canopy set up over the burial plot. We all wore rigid black clothing, standing shoulder to shoulder on the artificial green turf meant to hide the freshly dug earth. The pastor delivered a lengthy eulogy full of generic praises, failing to capture the sharp, observant nature of the man inside the polished mahogany casket. I stood at the back of the crowd, distancing myself from my parents and my sister. Savannah dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, performing grief for the benefit of the extended relatives. Before the groundskeepers even began to lower the casket, Uncle Vance grew restless. He stepped away from the front row, migrating toward the shade where my father stood. I watched them converse in low, urgent tones. The quiet respect required for a funeral did not apply to Vance. I edged closer, letting the crowd conceal my movement, until I was near enough to hear their voices over the drone of the pastor's final prayer. "We need to call the estate lawyer first thing Monday morning," Vance told my father, adjusting his dark sunglasses. Silas was sitting on 2,000 acres of prime commercial frontage. The city is expanding in this direction. If we subdivide the north pasture and rezone it, we can flip it to a developer for triple the market value. My father nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "We have to secure the deeds before the property taxes hit next quarter. Savannah needs a safety net and my investments are tied up." "Do not worry about it," Vance replied, clapping my father on the shoulder. "I will take the lead on the estate division. I already have a buyer lined up for the main ranch house. We are going to make a fortune off this dirt." They were dividing the spoils of his lifetime of labor before the man was even resting in the ground. The sheer disrespect curdled the grief in my stomach, twisting it into a cold, hard resolve. They saw Silas's legacy as a quick payout to cover their own financial blunders. They assumed the wealth would flow directly into their pockets, allowing them to continue their loud, boastful lives without consequence. I stood in the sweltering heat, staring at the polished wood of my grandfather's casket. I remembered the leather notebook. I remembered the lesson by the fence line. Let them run their mouths. Vance thought he had the entire estate figured out. He assumed the legal proceedings would be a mere formality, handing him the keys to the kingdom. He did not realize that Silas had spent his final years watching, taking notes, and preparing a quiet reckoning. The upcoming legal battle would not be a simple division of assets. It was going to be a fierce confrontation, and I was going to ensure my grandfather's true legacy remained untouched by their greed. The waiting room of Caldwell and Associates smelled of lemon polish and old paper. We sat in a row of stiff leather chairs while the receptionist avoided eye contact. My mother tapped her foot against the marble floor in a rapid rhythm. My father checked his watch every 2 minutes. Uncle Vance paced the length of the corridor, talking loudly on his cell phone about grading permits. Savannah sat beside me, scrolling through designer furniture catalogs on her phone. None of them looked like people mourning a patriarch. They looked like lottery winners waiting for their numbers to be called. Mr. Caldwell opened his heavy oak door and ushered us inside. His office was a testament to old Texas money. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and a grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the corner. We took our seats around a sprawling mahogany conference table. The air conditioning blasted cold air from the ceiling vents, but the atmosphere in the room felt thick and suffocating. Caldwell adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and opened a thick leather-bound folder. He did not offer condolences. He knew my family well enough to skip the pleasantries and get straight to the division of assets. My grandfather had amassed a substantial portfolio over his lifetime, and the people sitting around the table were practically vibrating with greed. The distribution began with Uncle Vance. Caldwell read the legal jargon in a monotone voice, but the details were unmistakable. Silas had left Vance a sprawling cattle ranch in the western part of the county, along with a very large sum of liquid cash held in a primary checking account. Vance let out a loud whoop, slapping his hand down on the mahogany table. He immediately turned to my father and started calculating how quickly he could bulldoze the grazing pastures to build a commercial logistics hub. He did not spare a single thought for the cattle or the legacy of the land. My parents were next. Caldwell announced they were receiving a generous cash payout and the deed to several lucrative mineral rights in the Permian Basin. My mother clutched her chest, feigning a brief moment of tearful gratitude, before immediately leaning over to whisper to my father about paying off their second mortgage and upgrading their vehicles. Savannah received a sizable trust fund specifically designated to secure her future investments. She squealed in delight, holding up her phone to show my mother a picture of a luxury outdoor kitchen she planned to install at her new house. The solemnity of a will reading vanished entirely. The room transformed into a crude celebration. They laughed and congratulated each other, their grief evaporating the moment the money became real. I sat at the far end of the table, keeping my hands folded in my lap. I watched them divide my grandfather up into bank deposits and real estate flips. Caldwell cleared his throat loudly, forcing the room to quiet down. He turned a page in his folder and peered over his glasses directly at me. "There is one final item," he said. His voice carried a strange weight that made the remaining laughter die out. "This is for Genevieve." My family turned to look at me. Savannah rolled her eyes, anticipating some meager token. Vance crossed his arms, wearing a smug smirk. Caldwell reached under his desk and brought out an object, setting it down with a heavy thud. He slid it across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of me. It was a wooden box. It was crafted from dark walnut, worn smooth at the corners from years of handling. A heavy brass padlock secured the front latch. It looked like something Silas would have kept on his workbench to hold loose nails or old receipts. I reached out and touched the lid. The wood felt cool and solid. Taped to the bottom of the box was a single rusted iron key. Caldwell looked down at his notes. Silas left very specific, legally binding instructions regarding this item, Genevieve. You are the sole recipient of this box and its contents. However, there is a strict stipulation attached to this inheritance. You are expressly forbidden from opening this box until a specific date. Vance scoffed, leaning forward. What kind of date? Caldwell ignored him, keeping his eyes on me. If you attempt to break the lock or use the key a single day before the specified date, all contents within the box will legally default to a state charity and you will forfeit everything. The date Silas chose is exactly 4 months from today. Caldwell read the date aloud. My breath caught in my throat. My pulse hammered in my ears. I knew that date. I had written that exact date on a grease-stained brisket napkin 5 years ago. It was the exact 5-year anniversary of the day Vance stood on the picnic table and bet the family $10,000 that I would always be a renter. Silas had remembered. He had been watching. The room remained silent for a fraction of a second as the family processed the oddity of the gift. Then Vance erupted into a booming, cruel laugh. The sound echoed off the dark wood paneling, bouncing around the room like a physical blow. Savannah joined in her laughter, high-pitched and mocking. "A wooden box," Vance chuckled, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. The old man left the successful folks the real estate and the cash, and he left the little computer girl a literal box of junk. That is poetic. Maybe you can use it as a coffee table in your rental apartment, Genevieve. Savannah leaned over and tapped the top of the box with her manicured fingernail. It is probably just some of his old whittling tools or a collection of rocks. You should be grateful, Jenny. It really fits your whole aesthetic. My father shook his head, looking at me with a mixture of pity and disappointment. My mother sighed deeply, returning her attention to her own financial documents, acting as if my inheritance was a mild embarrassment she had to endure. The heat crept up my neck. The urge to scream at them, to defend myself, and reveal the millions of dollars currently sitting in my hidden corporate accounts burned fiercely in my chest. I wanted to tell Vance that I could buy his new cattle ranch with a single wire transfer. I wanted to wipe the smug grin off Savannah's face by showing her the deed to a commercial high-rise downtown. But I looked down at the dark walnut wood. I remembered standing by the broken fence post in the cold November air. I remembered Silas telling me to let them run their mouths while I bought the land beneath their feet. He had given me this box for a reason. He had tied it to the most humiliating day of my life for a reason. I absorbed their mockery without saying a single word. I pulled the heavy box toward the edge of the table and gathered it into my arms, clutching it tightly against my chest. I could feel the cold metal of the rusted key pressing through the fabric of my shirt. The real test was not enduring their laughter today. The real test was the sheer willpower required to keep this box locked for the next 4 months. I had to survive their gloating, their endless boasts, and their impending bet collection without tipping my hand. Caldwell finalized the paperwork, passing around documents for signatures. The family signed their names with eager, frantic energy, ready to claim their prizes. I signed the single receipt, acknowledging I had received the locked box and understood the terms of the trust. Caldwell gave me a brief, knowing nod as he took the paper back. He knew more than he was saying, but he was bound by the legal framework my grandfather had constructed. We walked out of the stuffy law office and stepped into the blazing Texas sun. The heat radiated off the asphalt parking lot. Vance was riding high, boasting loudly to my father about contacting a zoning lawyer to fast-track his new commercial development. Savannah was already on her phone, scheduling an appointment with a luxury interior designer. I walked to my faded 10-year-old sedan. I opened the passenger door and gently placed the wooden box on the cracked leather seat, securing it with the seatbelt. It sat there holding a secret I could not access, a promise from a man who was no longer here to explain it. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, the broken exhaust pipe rattling loudly. Just as I put the car into gear, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a group text message from Uncle Vance sent to the entire Mercer family. Attached was a screenshot of a digital countdown timer application. The large, bold numbers ticked downward, showing the exact days, hours, and minutes remaining until the 5-year anniversary of the picnic table wager. Below the image, Vance had typed a message. "The clock is ticking down, renters. Hope you are saving your pennies, Genevieve, because we expect our 10 grand in cash. Do not think you can hide from your debts. We are throwing a party to collect." I stared at the ticking numbers on the screen. I looked over at the locked wooden box sitting quietly on the passenger seat. The date on the timer and the date I was legally allowed to turn the rusted key were the exact same day. My family thought they were counting down to my ultimate defeat. They had no idea they were actually counting down to their own ruin. I placed the phone in the cup holder and drove away from the law office, letting the countdown begin. 4 years and 10 months passed. The brutal Texas summer returned, bringing the kind of heat that baked the ground hard enough to crack concrete foundations. I checked my mail on a Tuesday morning and found a thick cardstock envelope wedged between utility bills at my decoy apartment address. Inside was a glossy, professionally printed invitation. Bold gold lettering stretched across the top reading, "The Renters Collection." Below the title were the details for a sprawling barbecue at Uncle Vance's ranch, scheduled exactly on the 5-year anniversary of his infamous picnic table wager. He had actually spent money to have premium invitations printed and mailed out just to ensure my humiliation had a formal dress code. My sister Savannah was listed as a co-host. I did not live in the vibrating studio apartment by the interstate anymore. Lone Star Analytics had grown far beyond a single laptop and a rattling cooling fan. I now operated out of a sleek corner office on the 22nd floor of a downtown Austin high-rise. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city skyline. I still wore simple denim jeans and plain cotton shirts, preferring practical comfort over the tailored suits my relatives paraded around in. My family believed I was still scraping by as a struggling freelancer, terrified of the impending $10,000 debt. They had no idea my software now managed proprietary predictive algorithms for 3 major national banks. More importantly, they did not know I had taken the surging profits from my tech firm and funneled them into a new, bold venture. I created an anonymous holding company called Ironwood Holdings. I used my machine learning models to identify distressed commercial real estate portfolios, snapping up prime lots and retail centers, before traditional developers even realized the properties were in financial trouble. I bought the land quietly, acting through layers of registered agents and non-disclosure agreements. The dramatic irony of my dual life reached its peak on a Thursday afternoon. I stood by my office window holding a ceramic mug of green tea, watching the heavy traffic crawl along the avenue below. My desk phone blinked with an incoming forwarded message. It was from my property management team. Uncle Vance owned a very profitable retail plaza in the northern suburbs. It was the crown jewel of his real estate portfolio, the property he bragged about at every Thanksgiving dinner. The problem for Vance was that he did not own the land underneath the buildings. He held a long-term ground lease that was set to expire in 30 days. If he could not secure a renewal, he would lose control of the plaza entirely, and his entire operation would fold like a cheap card table. Ironwood Holdings had purchased the deed to that specific tract of land 6 months ago. Vance had been calling my registered agents every single day, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails demanding to speak to the anonymous corporate landlord. He offered premium renewal rates. He threatened legal action. He begged. I sat at my desk and pulled up the audio files of his voicemails sent over by my legal team. I listened to his booming, arrogant voice slowly crack under the pressure of impending bankruptcy. "Listen to me," he growled into the phone on one recording. "I am a fixture in this community. You cannot just refuse my calls. Name your price. Just name your price, and we can sign the extension today." He had no clue the phantom landlord ignoring his calls was the niece he planned to humiliate in a few weeks. I instructed my lawyers to deny every request and refuse all lease extensions. I wanted him to feel the exact kind of helplessness he loved to inflict on others. Right as I closed the audio file, my personal cell phone rang. The screen displayed my mother's name. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my tone subdued and compliant. "Genevieve," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Your father and I received the barbecue invitation. Vance is pulling out all the stops. He hired a live band and a professional catering crew. We just wanted to check in and make sure you have the money ready." My father chimed in from the background, speaking over the speakerphone. "Do not make a scene, Jenny. Just bring the cash, hand it over, and let Vance have his moment. You owe the debt. It is a matter of honor. Save face, and we can all move past this without any more drama." I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. My parents were willing to sacrifice my dignity just to keep the peace with a man who was actively bullying their daughter. Their loyalty belonged to the loudest person in the room, regardless of how cruel he behaved. They wanted me to bow my head and hand over my pride so their weekend cookout would not be awkward. I stared out at the sprawling Austin skyline, a city I was quietly buying block by block. "I have the money ready, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "I will be at the party." My mother exhaled a loud theatrical sigh of relief. "Good girl. We just do not want you to ruin the afternoon by being stubborn. Wear something nice. Savannah is bringing her new country club friends. See you in a few weeks." The line went dead. I set the phone down. I did not feel sad or betrayed. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to people who fundamentally refused to see it. Silas was the only one who understood the game. He gave me that locked wooden box and forced me to wait. I looked at the dark walnut box sitting securely on a pedestal in the corner of my office. The rusted iron key was still taped to the bottom. The waiting period was almost over. The final month of the countdown was a blur of corporate acquisitions and careful silence. I attended status meetings, signed non-disclosure contracts, and watched Uncle Vance spiral further into financial ruin through my management team reports. Exactly 30 days before the designated barbecue date, the atmosphere in my office shifted. The sky outside darkened as a sudden Texas thunderstorm rolled across the plains, throwing heavy shadows against my office walls. Rain lashed against the thick glass windows, blurring the city lights. My executive assistant knocked on my heavy door, stepping into the room holding a damp envelope. "A private courier just dropped this off," she said, handing the package across my desk. He demanded a signature and refused to leave it with the front desk downstairs. He said it was highly confidential. I thanked her and waited for the door to close. The envelope was thick, sealed with red wax bearing the emblem of Caldwell and Associates. I reached for my brass letter opener and sliced the top edge. Inside was a single sheet of heavy parchment paper, typed with urgent precision. "Miss Mercer." The letter read, "Circumstances regarding your grandfather's estate have shifted. Certain individuals are attempting to force premature legal actions against the remaining assets. We must meet immediately. Do not come to my public office. Meet me at the address below tonight at 8 o'clock. Tell no one. The address provided was an old steakhouse on the outskirts of the city, a quiet place far away from the polished circles my family frequented. I read the words again, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Caldwell was a man who operated entirely by the book. He never sent cryptic messages, and he certainly never requested secret meetings outside of business hours. Silas had set a plan in motion 5 years ago, and whatever mechanism he had built was suddenly triggering early. I glanced over at the wooden box resting in the corner of my office. The brass padlock gleamed under the recessed lighting. The countdown had not just accelerated, it had fractured. Something was wrong, and the very foundation of my grandfather's final lesson was hanging in the balance. I folded the letter, grabbed my keys, and prepared to step into the storm. I did not drive to the dimly lit steakhouse on the outskirts of the city. If my grandfather left a contingency plan that required emergency meetings, I was going to conduct them on my own territory. I called the contact number printed at the bottom of the courier letter and gave the dispatcher my corporate address. I told them to send the attorney to the 22nd floor of the downtown high-rise. If we were playing a high-stakes game of financial strategy, I refused to do it hiding in a restaurant booth. 1 hour later, the private elevator chimed. Attorney Caldwell stepped onto the plush carpet of Lone Star Analytics, shaking the rain from his trench coat. He was a veteran of Texas probate law, a man who had spent 40 years navigating the greedy disputes of wealthy families. He normally projected an aura of bored impatience. Today, he paused in the reception lobby, staring at the sprawling operation with wide eyes. Data analysts worked quietly behind curved monitors, while projected heat maps of commercial real estate lit the frosted glass walls. Caldwell walked slowly toward my corner office, looking like a man who had just discovered a hidden kingdom. He stepped through my heavy oak door and took in the panoramic view of the storm-swept skyline. "You told the estate court you were a freelance consultant," he said, his voice laced with bewildered respect. "You let your uncle call you a struggling renter while you were building an empire right above his head." I gestured toward one of the leather chairs opposite my desk. "I learned a long time ago that talkers do not build, Mr. Caldwell. I prefer to work in the quiet." He offered a slow, appreciative nod, realizing that the unassuming rancher who hired him had chosen his heir perfectly. Caldwell unbuttoned his damp coat and took his seat. The sound of rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows filled the silence between us. He opened his leather folio and withdrew a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished surface of my desk. It was a high-resolution photocopy. I looked down and felt the air leave my lungs. Printed on the page was an exact replica of the grease-stained brisket napkin from the family reunion 5 years ago. My handwriting spelled out the date and the $10,000 figure. I stared at the attorney, my pulse hammering against my ribs. "I threw this in the trash at the end of the barbecue," I said, keeping my tone level despite the sudden shock. Caldwell leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Silas dug it out of the trash bin after the yard cleared," he explained. "Your grandfather watched your uncle humiliate you. He watched your parents stand by and do nothing. He saw you write that note, and he knew exactly what it meant. Silas brought that napkin into my office the very next morning. He slapped it down on this same folio and told me to draft a trust that would shatter your family's arrogance once and for all. He wanted to give you the weapon you needed, but he also knew you had to earn the strength to wield it." Caldwell pointed to the wooden box resting on the pedestal in the corner of my office. "You thought Silas left you a box of sentimental trinkets to match the cruelty of your relatives. You were wrong. That box contains the triggering documents for an irrevocable trust structured with predatory precision. During his final years, Silas liquidated his personal stock portfolios and operated through shadow holding companies. Uncle Vance always built his strip malls on cheap foundations, relying on risky variable rate loans to fund his boastful lifestyle. Silas knew the math would eventually catch up to him. He spent all his capital quietly purchasing the foundational debt and the original land deeds underneath Vance's primary commercial developments. He also bought the paper on several other key family assets, shielding them behind layers of corporate anonymity and placing everything inside that wooden box. My mind raced connecting the data points. I had used my own software to buy the ground lease for Vance's newest retail plaza, but Silas had secured the roots of the entire operation. My grandfather had effectively become the primary creditor for my uncle. If Vance defaulted, Silas owned him. And now the trust transferred that ultimate authority directly to me. But there is a catch. Caldwell continued, his tone shifting into grave legal territory. The trust contains a strict conditional trap. Silas tied the activation to the exact 5-year anniversary of that public bet. If you fail to turn that rusted iron key on the specific date listed on that napkin, the entire portfolio defaults. Every deed, every debt, and every asset will be automatically donated to a state land conservation charity. You will inherit nothing, and Vance will be free from the financial snare. You must open the box on the exact date of the barbecue. The realization settled over me like a heavy winter coat. I was no longer just trying to survive my family's petty harassment. I was holding the financial lives of my abusers in the palm of my hand. If I turned that key, I could bankrupt Uncle Vance with a single signature. I could pull the rug out from under the relatives who laughed at me. The shift from passive endurance to active, terrifying power was dizzying. I looked at the dark walnut wood of the box, understanding the profound weight of my grandfather's final lesson. He did not just want me to prove them wrong. He wanted me to become their landlord. He wanted me to own the very dirt they worshipped. The temptation to crack the padlock right then and there burned in my chest. I wanted to see the deeds. I wanted to hold the proof of my grandfather's silent loyalty. But the rusted key remained taped to the bottom of the wood guarding the trap. The discipline required to wait was agonizing. Silas had engineered a psychological test, knowing I would need ironclad patience to survive the corporate world. Caldwell reached down and lifted a heavy combination-locked briefcase from the floor, setting it on my desk next to the photocopy of the napkin. "The timeline is fracturing, Genevieve," he warned, lowering his voice. "Vance is bleeding cash. His lenders are circling. He is desperate to save his failing business before the end of the month." He unclasped the briefcase's locks with 2 sharp clicks. "We intercepted communications this morning indicating that your uncle is attempting to illegally leverage the remaining unsettled portions of your grandfather's estate. He is forging structural appraisals and trying to pledge estate land as collateral for a high-risk bridge loan. If he succeeds, he might tangle the clean assets in a fraudulent bankruptcy, tying up your trust in litigation for decades." The ticking clock was no longer just about enduring a party. It was a race to stop a financial crime that could destroy my grandfather's legacy. Vance was cornered and dangerous. He believed he was outsmarting the legal system, assuming no one was watching his maneuvers. He did not realize his quiet niece possessed the resources of a corporate intelligence firm and the legal backing of a furious ghost. Caldwell pushed the briefcase toward me. "This contains the preliminary injunction drafts and the unredacted ledgers of Vance's debt. You need to review these tonight. We have to trap him before he executes that loan. He must believe his plan is working until the very moment you spring the trust documents on him." I rested my hand off the cool leather of the briefcase, feeling the texture of the stitching. The storm lashed against the windows of my office, mirroring the conflict brewing inside me. The stage was set for a brutal collision. I had the data. I had the legal framework. I was finally armed for war. I told Caldwell I would review every page before sunrise. As he stood to leave the office, the lightning flashed, illuminating the wooden box in the corner. The countdown was no longer a threat. It was a promise. The private elevator chimed softly, signaling Attorney Caldwell departing my floor. I stood alone in the center of my corner office. The storm outside battered the thick glass windows, sending sheets of rain cascading down the panes like a curtain closing off the rest of Austin. The only light in the room came from the faint glow of my computer monitors and the muted amber desk lamp illuminating the dark walnut box resting on its pedestal. I walked over to the mahogany desk and looked at the digital clock glowing near my keyboard. It read 11:58. I watched the numbers change. 11:59. The silence in the corporate suite felt dense, charged with the static electricity of the storm and the weight of a 5-year waiting game. The neon display shifted to 12:00. Midnight had arrived. The exact date of the family reunion wager was now the present day. The legal restriction constructed by my grandfather had formally expired. I was permitted to break the seal. I approached the pedestal and peeled the adhesive tape from the bottom of the wooden box. The rusted iron key dropped into my palm. It was heavy, cold, and rough against my skin. I inserted the jagged metal into the brass padlock securing the front latch. The internal tumblers resisted for a fraction of a second before yielding with a harsh metallic scrape. The lock clicked open. I pulled the heavy padlock free and set it on the glass surface of my desk. I lifted the wooden lid. The scent of dry, aged paper and cedar wood filled the sterile air of my office, transporting me back to the dusty workshop where my grandfather used to impart his quiet wisdom. Inside the box lay several thick stacks of legal documents bound tightly by thick rubber bands. The edges of the paper were crisp, indicating they had been filed and stored with meticulous care. Resting on top of the legal bundles was a single white envelope addressed to me in the familiar block handwriting of Silas Mercer. I opened the flap and withdrew a sheet of lined notebook paper. The message was brief, stripping away any unnecessary sentimentality. The letter read, "They bet on your failure. I bet on your silence. Build your empire on their arrogance." I read the words 3 times, letting the raw truth of his strategy sink into my bones. He did not leave me empty encouragement. He left me a tactical mandate. I folded the letter and placed it carefully beside my keyboard. I reached into the box and lifted the first stack of documents. These were the foundational deeds Caldwell had mentioned, the commercial ground leases for Uncle Vance and his sprawling retail plazas. I flipped through the pages, seeing the precise predatory math Silas had employed to secure the dirt beneath my uncle's boastful developments. But as I untied the second bundle of files, the narrative of my family took a dark, sickening turn. These documents were not commercial contracts. I stared at a residential property deed bearing the address of my parents' home in the suburbs. Stapled beneath the deed was a second mortgage agreement, along with a series of promissory notes. The numbers printed in bold black ink were staggering. I traced the dates, tracking a timeline of financial ruin. 5 years ago, right around the time of the infamous picnic table wager, Thomas and Linda Mercer had leveraged their primary residence to the brink of foreclosure. The attached banking disbursement records revealed exactly where the borrowed funds had gone. Savannah Mercer. I saw the bank transfers matching the exact $50,000 down payment for her pristine suburban home. I saw secondary transfers designated for luxury vehicles, designer furniture, and exclusive country club membership dues. My parents had secretly hollowed out their own financial foundation to maintain the glittering illusion of my sister's success. While they publicly mocked my grueling 80-hour workweeks and dismissed my data science career as a childish hobby, they were quietly drowning in toxic debt to fund a golden child who squandered every penny she touched. The records showed that 3 years ago, the primary lending bank prepared to foreclose on my parents' home. They were weeks away from public eviction and total social disgrace. Silas stepped in. He used his anonymous shadow holding company to purchase their distressed debt directly from the bank. He became their sole creditor, saving them from ruin while hiding his intervention behind corporate privacy shields. He kept them in their house, but he held the leash. Now, according to the trust transition documents I had just executed, those debt portfolios belonged to me. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, the material creaking softly in the quiet room. I stared at the sprawling Austin skyline through the rain-swept windows. I was now technically the landlord for my arrogant uncle and the primary creditor for my own mother and father. The psychological weight of this power pressed against my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. If I chose to execute these contracts, I would bankrupt Vance before the banks even opened on Monday morning. I would foreclose on my parents, stripping away the false reality they had spent a lifetime constructing. I held the legal authority to render them all homeless. The dilemma threatened to overwhelm my focus. Must I demolish my own family to secure my survival and protect my grandfather's legacy? They had erased me, humiliated me, and offered me as a public sacrifice to appease Vance. But pulling the trigger on their financial execution felt like crossing a line from which I could never return. My cell phone lit up on the desk, shattering the quiet introspection. The screen displayed the name Thomas Mercer. I glanced at the clock. It was 1 in the morning. My father never called this late unless he needed to issue a command. I swiped the screen and answered, keeping my breathing steady. Genevieve. His voice barked through the speaker, echoing with unearned authority. You need to be at the ranch by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Vance wants the folding chairs and tables set up before the caterers arrive. I sat frozen, holding the phone to my ear. He did not ask if I was awake. He did not ask how I was doing. The man who had secretly bankrupted his own future for Savannah was calling to demand I perform manual labor for my own public execution. Savannah is bringing her friends from the neighborhood association, he continued, his tone laced with heavy condescension. We need the yard looking perfect. Do not cause a scene tomorrow, Genevieve. Bring the cash in a certified check, hand it over to Vance, and take your lumps. We are giving you a chance to handle this debt like an adult, so do not embarrass your mother and me. I listened to the arrogant cadence of his voice. I looked down at the foreclosure documents resting on my desk, the very papers that proved he did not own the roof over his head. The internal conflict that had been suffocating me a moment ago vaporized instantly. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculated clarity. They were not victims. They were architects of their own demise, eagerly preparing a stage to humiliate the only person holding their safety net. I hear you, Dad, I replied, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. I will be there early. Make sure you are, he snapped, and the line went dead. I lowered the phone and placed it on top of the promissory notes. I did not feel the need to shrink myself anymore. I did not feel the urge to keep the peace for people who viewed my dignity as the price of admission to their social circles. Silas had not given me this power, so I could cower in the shadows and pay their debts. He gave me the power so I could enforce the consequences they had evaded for decades. I reached for my sleek leather portfolio and began neatly stacking the property deeds, the mortgage documents, and the trust transition paperwork. I placed the original grease-stained brisket napkin on top of the stack. I zipped the portfolio shut, sealing the evidence inside. The storm continued to rage outside my window. But inside the office, the atmosphere was perfectly calm. The time for passive survival was over. I was ready to attend the barbecue. 3 days before the barbecue, the sweltering Texas heat broke, giving way to a humid, overcast afternoon in downtown Austin. I walked through the climate-controlled corridors of the Domain, an upscale outdoor retail complex that catered to the city's wealthy elite. The polished limestone floors echoed with the click of expensive heels and the soft ambient music playing from hidden speakers. I wore my usual attire, consisting of dark raw denim and a plain gray cotton shirt. I was not there to shop. I was there for an on-site inspection. Ironwood Holdings, my anonymous corporate entity, had quietly finalized the purchase of this entire commercial retail sector 48 hours earlier. The luxury boutiques, the high-end artisanal markets, the sprawling valet parking zones, they all belonged to my portfolio now. I paused near a glass storefront reviewing a digital ledger on my phone when a loud, familiar voice shattered the quiet atmosphere. Genevieve, what are you doing here? I lowered my phone and turned. My older sister Savannah marched toward me holding 3 oversized shopping bags bearing the logos of premium European designers. She wore a silk summer dress and oversized sunglasses pushed back onto her head. Her wrists clinked with gold bracelets, a sharp contrast to the financial ruin I knew hid behind her bank accounts. Savannah had always treated retail therapy as a competitive sport. Growing up, while I saved my tutoring money to buy secondhand computer parts, she threw tantrums until our parents funded her mall excursions. She measured human value by brand names and price tags. I am just running an errand, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Savannah let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. An errand at the Domain? Are you looking for a cheap dress to wear for your big public apology this weekend? You know Vance is going to make you stand up in front of everyone. You should at least try to look like you belong in our family. She adjusted her heavy shopping bags, ensuring the brand logos faced outward. I just put $10,000 of new outdoor furniture on my card for the patio, she boasted. Real teak wood. Mom and Dad are coming over to see it next week. That is what real investment looks like, Jenny. You have to spend money to make money. It is a shame you never learned how to build a life. I stared at her manicured hands, gripping the rope handles of her bags. I knew the exact credit limit on the cards she was maxing out. I knew those cards were tied to the home equity line of credit our parents had secretly drained to zero. Savannah was bragging about buying teak wood chairs with money stolen from our parents' retirement. She stood inside a retail complex that I personally owned, lecturing me about real estate and investments. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt like physical pressure in the air. Instead of arguing, I simply nodded toward the checkout counter of the adjacent artisanal grocery boutique we were standing near. A young mother was standing at the register holding a fussy toddler on her hip. The cashier had just bagged a selection of organic baby formula and premium groceries, but the card reader was flashing a bright red declined notification. The young woman frantically searched through her purse, her face flushing with deep embarrassment as the line behind her began to grow impatient. Savannah scoffed, shifting her weight. God, I hate when people come to these places and cannot even afford to check out. It holds up the entire line. She should stick to the discount stores. I did not reply to my sister. I walked past her, approaching the register with quiet, deliberate steps. The young mother looked close to tears, apologizing to the cashier while digging for another card. I stepped up beside her and withdrew a solid black American Express card from my wallet. It was heavy, made of anodized titanium, and carried no preset spending limit. I tapped the metal edge against the payment terminal. A soft chime sounded, and the screen immediately glowed green, indicating the transaction was approved. I turned to the young woman, offering a brief, polite smile. You are all set, I said quietly. Have a good afternoon. The mother stared at me in shock, stammering a thank you as she gathered her bags. I returned my card to my wallet and turned back to face my sister. Savannah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the spot where the black titanium card had just been. She knew enough about wealth to recognize that specific piece of metal. Her confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second, her brow furrowing in confusion. She quickly recovered, masking her uncertainty with a sneer. Did you drain your entire savings account just to play savior for a stranger? She asked, her voice rising in pitch. You are going to need every penny you have on Saturday. Uncle Vance is not going to let you off the hook. He told the whole family we are going to make an example of you. You are going to sign that check and admit you are a failure in front of 100 people. I stood on the polished limestone floor of my own building, listening to my sister threaten me with a $10,000 debt. I felt no anger. I felt no fear. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my simple cotton shirt. I looked Savannah directly in the eyes, stripping away the compliant sister facade I had worn for 28 years. I am looking forward to the barbecue, Savannah, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, chilling register. Just do me one favor. Make sure you read the fine print before you cash the check. Savannah blinked, the hostility draining from her face replaced by genuine unease. The cryptic warning broke through her rehearsed arrogance. She opened her mouth to issue another insult, but the words died in her throat. She gripped her designer shopping bags tighter, taking a slight step backward. I did not wait for her to find her voice. I turned and walked away down the corridor, leaving her standing alone in the center of the shopping plaza, trying to calculate a puzzle she did not have the pieces to solve. While I walked out into the humid Austin air, preparing my final strategy, a very different scene was unfolding in a cramped, unventilated office 30 miles away. Uncle Vance sat behind a cheap veneer desk, sweating through the underarms of his tailored suit. His usual booming confidence had evaporated, leaving behind the frantic, nervous energy of a man trapped in a burning building. Sitting across from Vance was a private commercial lender named Arthur. Arthur did not operate out of a polished bank downtown. He dealt in high-risk short-term bridge loans, charging ruinous interest rates to desperate developers who had run out of legitimate options. Arthur slid a thick stack of loan documents across the desk, tapping a gold pen against the signature line. "The terms are brutal, Vance," Arthur said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. 20% interest compounded monthly. You miss a single payment and I take ownership of your entire vehicle fleet and your management office. You have 30 days to secure a lease renewal on your primary plaza, or this debt will bury you. Vance wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, leaving a dark smear of sweat on the fabric. He stared at the unforgiving numbers printed on the contract. His commercial real estate empire was built entirely on smoke and mirrors. He had leveraged one property to buy another, relying on steady rental income to keep the house of cards standing. Now the anonymous corporate landlord of his most profitable plaza was refusing his calls, threatening to evict his anchor tenants. His cash flow had dried up completely. "I am good for it, Arthur," Vance growled, his voice tight with desperation. "I have a major cash influx coming this weekend. My father's estate is finally being settled. The old man left me a fortune in liquid assets. I just need to get past this family reunion and force my niece to sign over her share. She owes me. I am going to squeeze her dry and use the cash to float the operations until the estate clears probate." Arthur shrugged, offering the gold pen. "I do not care where the money comes from, Vance. I just care that it arrives on time. Sign the paper." Vance grabbed the pen, his hand shaking slightly. He pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed his name legally, binding himself to a toxic loan that would destroy him if he missed a single deadline. He pushed the documents back across the desk, exhaling a heavy, ragged breath. Vance stood up from his desk after Arthur left the office, pacing the length of the worn carpet. He picked up a framed photograph from his credenza. It was a picture taken a decade ago showing Vance shaking hands with a local politician in front of a newly paved parking lot. Back then, he was the king of the suburban sprawl. Now he was a beggar holding a tin cup disguised as a cowboy hat. He slammed the frame face down on the wood. He needed this barbecue to be a spectacle. He needed the adoration of the extended family to mask the reality of his failure. He grabbed his phone and began dialing the catering company, demanding they upgrade the menu to prime rib and imported beer. He was funding his own execution with borrowed money. Back in my high-rise office, I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the twilight settle over the Texas Capitol. The dark walnut box sat empty on the pedestal, its purpose fulfilled. The documents were secured inside my leather portfolio. I had reviewed the unredacted ledgers Caldwell provided, mapping out every single vulnerability in my uncle's portfolio and my parents' mortgage. I knew exactly which strings to pull and when to pull them. My grandfather had spent 5 years setting the board. He had gathered the pieces, purchased the debts, and locked the mechanism behind a single date. I had spent those same 5 years learning how to play the game in absolute silence. The fusion of his old-school patience and my modern data analytics had forged an inescapable net. I picked up the original grease-stained brisket napkin from my desk, holding it up to the ambient light of the city. The faded ink spelling out $10,000 looked incredibly small now. The price they put on my dignity was going to cost them everything they owned. I carefully placed the napkin back into the leather portfolio and zipped it shut. I turned off the desk lamp, plunging the office into darkness. The pre-party skirmishes were over. The waiting was over. Tomorrow morning I would drive to the ranch and give my family exactly the show they had asked for. The morning of the family reunion broke with a punishing humidity that settled over Austin before the sun even cleared the horizon. The air felt thick and heavy, carrying the promise of a sweltering afternoon. I stood in my climate-controlled downtown office, laying out the contents of my sleek black leather portfolio on the glass desk. I organized the paperwork with the same clinical precision I applied to my predictive algorithms. First went the original property deeds, securing the ground beneath my uncle's commercial plazas. Next came the trust documents drafted by my grandfather alongside the banknotes, proving I now owned the debt on my parents' suburban home. Finally, I placed the fragile grease-stained brisket napkin right on top. The faded ink displaying the $10,000 wager served as the anchor for the entire collection. I zipped the portfolio shut and picked up my cell phone. I dialed the direct line for Attorney Caldwell. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism of a man who had already been working for hours. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, keeping my tone even and measured. "The timeline we discussed is culminating today. My uncle is hosting a gathering at his ranch this afternoon to publicly demand the debt he believes I owe him. I would like you to attend this event as my personal guest. I need you on site to authenticate these documents the moment I present them." Caldwell let out a low, appreciative hum. He understood the strategic value of an undisputed legal authority standing in the middle of a family dispute. "I will clear my afternoon schedule, Genevieve," he replied. "Send a car for me." I would not miss the conclusion of Silas Mercer's final lesson for anything. I ended the call and walked down to the subterranean parking garage of my building. For the past 5 years, I had driven a rattling decade-old sedan to every family function, deliberately playing the part of the struggling tech worker. Today, that sedan remained parked in a dark corner. I walked over to a pristine, armored black sport utility vehicle. I had purchased it through my corporate holding company for executive transport. The vehicle featured bullet-resistant glass-reinforced steel panels and an engine that purred with quiet, terrifying power. It was discreet but undeniable. I slid into the driver's seat, savoring the scent of new leather and the chill of the air conditioning. I dispatched a private town car to retrieve Caldwell from his law firm and directed it to meet me at the edge of town. The drive out to the hill country took nearly an hour. The concrete highways gave way to winding 2-lane roads lined with dried scrub brush and barbed wire fences. The relentless Texas sun baked the landscape, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. I met Caldwell at a designated rest stop near the county line. He climbed into the passenger seat of my vehicle, adjusting his tie and offering a brief, solemn nod. We drove the remaining distance in companionable silence. We approached the wrought iron gates of Uncle Vance's sprawling ranch. The property was a monument to his fragile ego, featuring oversized limestone pillars and a winding gravel driveway that kicked up thick clouds of white dust. Cars lined the edges of the pasture, ranging from lifted pickup trucks to luxury sedans. I navigated my heavy vehicle through the maze of parked cars, finding a spot near the back edge of the lot. I turned off the engine. The sudden quiet inside the insulated cabin felt stark compared to the muffled thumping of country music playing in the distance. I grabbed my leather portfolio from the center console. Caldwell unbuckled his seatbelt, projecting a calm readiness. We stepped out of the vehicle, and the suffocating midday heat immediately wrapped around us. We walked shoulder to shoulder up the slight incline toward the main yard. The air smelled of burning mesquite wood, roasting meat, and sweet barbecue sauce. Over 100 relatives milled about the property. Children chased each other around the oak trees, while adults clustered in groups holding red plastic cups and sweating glass bottles. My arrival usually sparked a wave of condescending pity. Today, the reaction was different. People turned to look at the sleek, armored vehicle we had just stepped out of, their brows furrowing in confusion. They looked at Caldwell, noting his expensive, tailored suit and authoritative posture. They looked at me, standing tall in dark, raw denim and a crisp white linen button-down shirt, holding a thick leather portfolio instead of a cheap dish to share. The visual data did not match the narrative they had been fed. I scanned the yard, treating the crowd like a complex data set. I identified the clusters of influence, the weak points, and the center of gravity. The center of gravity was located right next to the massive custom-built smoker pit. Uncle Vance had set up a staging area. A large wooden easel stood on the grass, supporting a giant, oversized novelty check. It was the kind of prop used for lottery winners or charity donations. Printed across the payee line in bold, mocking letters was the phrase, "The Mercer Family Pot." The amount box displayed $10,000. The signature line was left blank, waiting for me. A group of my younger cousins stood near the easel, pointing at the check and snickering behind their hands. Savannah held court a few feet away, wearing a flowing sundress and sipping a mimosa. She caught my eye and offered a wide, predatory smile, nudging the cousin next to her. She believed this was the day her superiority would be permanently cemented. She had no idea her own home was resting inside the leather case tucked under my arm. I shifted my gaze, scanning the perimeter for my parents. I found them standing near the beverage coolers. My mother, Linda, wore a wide-brimmed sun hat, fixing her attention on organizing a stack of paper plates. My father, Thomas, kept his head down, intensely focused on slicing a lime. They both saw me arrive. They both saw the giant, humiliating check waiting for their daughter. They chose to look away, complicit in the cruelty through their cowardice. They preferred the comfort of Vance's approval over the basic dignity of their own child. I did not feel the sting of rejection. I felt the cold, clinical detachment of an engineer identifying a failed system. I walked forward, closing the distance between the edge of the yard and the staging area. Caldwell stayed one step behind my right shoulder, a silent sentinel of impending legal doom. The lively chatter of the reunion began to taper off as more relatives noticed my approach. The murmurs rippled through the crowd, shifting the atmosphere from a carefree celebration to a tense, suffocating anticipation. The heat seemed to amplify, pressing down on the guests as they formed a loose semicircle around the barbecue pit. They were eager to watch the execution, but unsettled by the calm demeanor of the condemned. Uncle Vance noticed the shift in the crowd. He stood near a keg of beer, wiping sweat from his forehead with a cloth handkerchief. He wore a Western pearl snap shirt, tailored tight to show off his chest, paired with pristine boots that had never touched actual worksite mud. He saw me standing near the novelty check, and his eyes lit up with malicious glee. He did not notice Caldwell's calculating stare or the heavy portfolio in my hands. He only saw the culmination of his 5-year joke. Vance tossed his handkerchief onto a nearby table and marched toward a large speaker system set up on the patio. He grabbed a wired microphone from the soundboard. The heavy thumping bass of the country song abruptly cut out, plunging the yard into a stark, heavy silence. The only sounds remaining were the crackle of the mesquite fire and the hum of cicadas in the oak trees. He tapped the metal grill of the microphone 3 times. The sharp thuds echoed across the lawn, commanding the attention of every single person present. Vance turned to face the crowd, wearing a smile that resembled a predator baring its teeth. The public execution they had waited 5 years for was about to begin. The feedback whine of the public address system pierced the humid air, sending a sharp screech across the manicured lawn. Uncle Vance stood beside the giant smoker pit, holding the microphone in one hand and a heavy glass jar in the other. Inside the jar, the 5-year-old $100 bills pressed against the glass, creating a faded monument to my supposed inevitable failure. He raised the jar high above his head, shaking it so the loose coins and folded paper rustled loudly. The sound served as a dinner bell for the Mercer family, drawing over 100 relatives closer to the staging area. Children stopped running around the oak trees, and adults abandoned their lawn games, moving toward the center of the yard with eager anticipation. "Listen up, everyone," Vance boomed, his voice echoing off the limestone facade of his ranch house. 5 summers ago, we made a wager right here on this property. We placed a bet on our resident computer genius. I said that playing on a laptop would never pay the bills. I said she would never own a single square foot of Texas dirt and would spend her life paying rent to people like me. He paced back and forth, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple with the back of his hand. He reveled in the attention, basking in the glow of his own perceived superiority. "Well, the deadline has arrived," Vance continued, pointing a thick finger in my direction. 5 years have passed, and from what I hear, Genevieve is still typing away in a tiny box apartment off the interstate. She is still chasing invisible data while the rest of us are building real equity. He paused, letting his words hang in the stagnant heat to ensure maximum impact. The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding along with his assessment of my life. Vance walked over to the wooden easel, supporting the oversized novelty check. He tapped the thick paperboard with his knuckles, producing a hollow thud. "So today, we are here to collect," Vance shouted into the microphone. $10,000 goes into the family pot. It is time to pay the piper, Jenny. Step on up here, sign the line, and admit that Uncle Vance knows best. It is time for you to face reality and accept your place in this world. The crowd erupted into a chorus of harsh laughter and scattered applause. Cousins clinked their brown glass beer bottles together, amplifying the public degradation. The sharp clinking sound cut through the heavy air, marking their shared amusement at my expense. Savannah leaned against a patio pillar, sipping a bright orange mimosa. Her eyes gleamed with triumphant delight. She thrived on seeing me reduced to a punchline, believing my failure somehow validated her own hollow existence. She nudged the cousin standing next to her, whispering a cruel joke that generated another wave of snickering. I did not shrink from the noise. I did not avert my gaze or let my shoulders drop. I stepped forward, closing the distance between the perimeter of the yard and the center stage. My movements were deliberate and unhurried, reflecting the calm certainty of a predator moving through tall grass. Caldwell matched my pace, his polished leather shoes crunching against the dry earth. His presence alone should have served as a warning. He did not look like a family friend or a casual guest. He radiated the cold, intimidating authority of a seasoned litigator preparing to dismantle a hostile witness. We stopped mere feet from the wooden easel. I looked at the giant check, examining the bold black lettering spelling out the Mercer family pot. I shifted my focus directly to my uncle. He stood tall, radiating arrogant satisfaction, expecting tears or a furious outburst. He wanted me to beg or argue so he could swat me down and prove his dominance. Instead, I kept my expression entirely neutral, draining all emotion from my face. "Uncle Vance," I said, projecting my voice just enough to carry over the dying laughter. "Are you certain you want to do this publicly? We can step inside the house and handle this business privately." The offer hung in the stagnant air. For a fleeting second, a shadow of confusion crossed Vance's face. He glanced at Caldwell, noting the sharp, tailored suit and the heavy briefcase gripped in the attorney's hand. A smart man would have recognized the danger and accepted the graceful exit I was offering. But Vance's ego was a fragile, bloated entity, currently starved for validation due to his hidden financial ruin. He was drowning in toxic debt and desperate bridge loans. He could not afford to back down in front of his audience. He needed the spectacle to mask his own crumbling empire. He needed the family to see him as a winner, because the banks already knew he was a loser. He gripped the microphone tighter, pulling it close to his mouth. "Private business," he scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "We do not hide in the shadows in this family. A bet is a bet in Texas. We make our wagers in the daylight, and we settle them in the daylight. You stood out here 5 years ago and agreed to the terms. Now you are going to stand out here and be humbled. You need to learn how the real world works, Genevieve. You need to swallow your pride and face the music." I turned my head slowly, seeking out my mother and father. They stood near the edge of the crowd, holding paper plates laden with barbecue ribs and potato salad. Linda adjusted the wide brim of her sun hat, staring intently at her food, refusing to meet my eyes. Thomas shifted his weight, looking toward the horizon, pretending he did not hear the cruelty echoing across the lawn. They had the power to intervene, to tell Vance he was taking the joke too far. They could have stepped in to protect their daughter from public humiliation. They chose silence. They chose complicity. They preferred to appease a bully rather than defend their own child. Their inaction provided the final confirmation I needed. The last lingering shred of guilt inside me vanished. They were sealing their fate irrevocably. I nodded slowly, turning my attention back to Vance. He held out a thick black marker, expecting me to take it and sign the novelty check. The crowd held its breath, waiting for my surrender. The anticipation was palpable, a collective hunger to witness my defeat. I did not reach for the marker. I kept my hands resting at my sides, letting the silence stretch out. I elongated the moment until the tension became a physical pressure in the yard. The only sounds remaining were the crackle of the mesquite fire and the distant cry of a hawk circling above the ranch. I allowed them to fully commit to their toxicity. I gave them every opportunity to reconsider, to show a single ounce of grace or familial loyalty. They offered none. The crowd stared at me with expectant, mocking grins. Vance thrust the marker closer, his patience wearing thin. Savannah took a step forward, eager to secure a front-row seat for my capitulation. I catalogued every face, recording their expressions in my mind. I tucked the leather portfolio under my left arm, supporting its heavy weight. My right hand reached across my body, grasping the brass zipper tab. The cool metal felt smooth under my fingertips. I locked eyes with my uncle, watching the arrogant smirk plastered across his face. I pulled the zipper down with a slow, deliberate motion. The rasping sound of the teeth parting cut through the silence, signaling the end of the waiting game. The portfolio was open. The pressure cooker was about to detonate. I pulled the brass zipper all the way down the edge of the leather portfolio. The metal teeth parted smoothly under my fingers. I reached inside and withdrew a thick manila folder containing over 200 pages of property records and certified banknotes. I stepped past Uncle Vance and walked directly to the cedar picnic table where he had placed his glass jar of faded bills. I lifted the heavy folder high enough for the front row of relatives to see it clearly and let it drop onto the wood. The thick stack of paper hit the cedar planks with a dense, heavy thud. The sound echoed across the patio, cutting through the ambient noise of the barbecue and the country music playing softly in the background. It was a weighted, authoritative sound that instantly commanded the yard. The snickering from my younger cousins faded into an uneasy quiet. Savannah lowered her mimosa glass, her predatory smile faltering as she stared at the bulging folder resting next to the jar of cash. Vance scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. He asked me what I had brought to his party, questioning if I had printed a stack of computer code instead of a certified bank check. He told the crowd that our family did not accept digital currency to settle debts. I stepped back from the table and nodded to the man standing by my side. Attorney Caldwell moved forward. His polished leather shoes crunched softly against the dry gravel. He did not raise his voice, but he projected the quiet, lethal authority of a seasoned courtroom veteran. He looked at the crowd the way a judge surveys a courtroom before delivering a sentence. He announced his name, clearly stating he was the senior partner at Caldwell and Associates and the designated legal executor of the Silas Mercer estate. He told the silent crowd that he was present today in his official capacity to oversee the execution of a binding, irrevocable trust established by their late patriarch 5 years ago. The air in the yard grew stagnant and thick. The mention of the name of my grandfather acted as a heavy weight dropping over the crowd. The arrogant posture of Vance slipped away. His arms uncrossed, and a flicker of genuine confusion passed over his weathered features. My parents exchanged a panicked glance, realizing that the presence of a high-powered estate lawyer meant the dynamics of the afternoon had fundamentally changed. I reached out and took the wired microphone from the hand of my uncle. He surrendered it without a fight, too bewildered by the introduction from Caldwell to protest. I held the cold metal grip, feeling the hum of the amplifier vibrating against my palm. I looked out over the sea of faces tracing the lineage of relatives who had gathered to witness my degradation. I took a slow breath, letting the heat of the Texas afternoon settle around me. You placed a wager 5 years ago that I would spend my life as a renter. I spoke clearly into the microphone, letting the speakers project my voice across the sprawling lawn. You assumed that because I chose data over dirt, I would never build anything of value. You were mistaken on every count. I do not rent an apartment. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Lone Star Analytics. My anonymous holding company recently purchased the $12 million commercial high-rise in downtown Austin where my corporate headquarters is located. I own the building free and clear. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Relatives murmured to one another, exchanging looks of sheer disbelief. Savannah dropped her jaw, her designer sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. My mother clutched her paper plate so tightly the edges crumpled inward, spilling potato salad onto the grass. But my success in the tech industry is only a fraction of the reason we are gathered here today. I continued, holding their attention with an iron grip. I turned my body to face Uncle Vance. I reached into the manila folder and extracted the first stack of crisp legal deeds bound by a thick rubber band. You talk a lot about the value of Texas dirt, Uncle Vance, I said, walking slowly toward him. You pride yourself on the retail plazas you built in the northern suburbs. You believe those concrete structures make you a king in this county. But a king must own his kingdom. You built your empire on a variable ground lease. You never owned the earth beneath your buildings. I held the deeds up for the crowd to see, letting the stark white paper catch the afternoon sun. My grandfather Silas despised loud, arrogant men who built their lives on borrowed foundations. He spent his final years quietly purchasing the distressed debt and the original land deeds underneath your primary commercial developments. He transferred every single acre into the irrevocable trust executed by Mr. Caldwell. Vance stepped back, shaking his head in denial. His face began to lose its color, draining from a flushed red to a sickly, ashen gray. His breathing turned shallow and rapid as his mind tried to calculate the implications of my words. As of midnight last night, I said, lowering the deeds and locking eyes with him, the legal restrictions on that trust expired. The title transfers are complete and legally binding. I am the sole beneficiary. You do not own the land beneath your crown jewel Plaza Vance. I do. I am your legal landlord, and your current lease expires in 30 days. The silence that followed was total. It was not the quiet of anticipation, but the suffocating stillness of a bomb detonating in a closed room. The relatives who had been laughing moments ago now stared at Vance with wide, terrified eyes, recognizing that the patriarch of their social circle had just been financially decapitated. Vance lunged forward, snatching the bundle of deeds from my hand. His fingers trembled as he flipped through the thick parchment pages. His eyes scanned the unassailable signatures, the official county notary stamps, and the corporate shell company names linking back to my trust. The reality of the checkmate hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, bumping into the metal frame of the oversized novelty check. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, as the illusion of his wealth shattered in his hands. I did not give the crowd time to process his collapse. I reached back into the manila folder and pulled out the second bundle of documents. I turned away from my uncle and focused my gaze on my parents standing paralyzed near the beverage coolers. This is not just about commercial real estate, I said, addressing my mother and father. You stood by and watched your family mock me because you believed Savannah was your golden ticket. You celebrated her new house, and you judged me for working 80-hour weeks in a studio apartment. You decided I was the failure because my labor was invisible to you. I walked toward them, holding the residential property deeds and the promissory notes. I laid them on top of the nearest cooler right next to the trembling hands of my mother. You forgot that data leaves a trail, I said, keeping my tone clinically cold. You took out a reckless second mortgage on your own home to fund the $50,000 down payment for Savannah along with her designer furniture and her country club lifestyle. You drove yourselves to the edge of foreclosure to maintain an illusion of superiority. Savannah let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at our parents, her eyes wide with sudden panic, realizing her entire lifestyle was built on stolen equity. Her friends from the neighborhood association stepped away from her, creating a physical distance that mirrored her newfound social ruin. When the bank prepared to foreclose on your house 3 years ago, Grandpa Silas stepped in. I revealed, my voice echoing across the silent yard. He purchased your debt directly from the lending institution to save you from public disgrace. He hid his intervention behind a corporate privacy shield. He kept a roof over your heads, but he retained the paperwork. My father? Thomas closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his weathered cheek. He bowed his head, knowing that his decades of cowardice had finally caught up with him. Those promissory notes were transferred into the same trust, I concluded, turning to face the entire stunned audience. I am now the primary creditor for the home belonging to my parents. I hold the power to initiate foreclosure proceedings on Monday morning. You wagered $10,000 on my failure. You wagered your own home on the success of Savannah. You lost both bets. I handed the microphone to Caldwell. The attorney placed it gently on the picnic table. The feedback hummed softly before fading away, leaving the yard in profound silence. The Mercer family stood frozen, trapped in a tableau of their own making. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The fragrant smoke from the barbecue pit continued to drift over the yard, carrying the scent of a celebration that had swiftly transformed into a funeral for their arrogance. Uncle Vance remained slumped against the wooden easel, clutching the deeds to his ruined empire. He looked small and frail, stripped of his boastful armor. My parents stared at the foreclosure documents resting on the cooler, paralyzed by the horrifying truth that their discarded daughter now controlled their destiny. Savannah wept quietly, the sound muffled by her trembling hands as she realized her life of luxury was entirely counterfeit. I stood in the center of the lawn, feeling the punishing Texas heat radiating off the dry earth. The giant, oversized novelty check remained propped up on the easel. It was supposed to be the instrument of my ultimate humiliation. Now it stood in the middle of the yard, serving as a towering monument to their catastrophic miscalculation. I had given them exactly what they asked for. I had settled the debt in the daylight. The frozen tableau of the Mercer family reunion lasted only a few seconds before the reality of the situation fractured their united front. The silence shattered into a chaotic chorus of overlapping voices. The first to break was Savannah. All her life, my older sister had relied on a carefully curated facade of effortless wealth. She navigated social circles by projecting an aura of pristine success, while ignoring the growing mountain of debt accumulating beneath her feet. Now that the illusion was stripped away, the panic set in fast and sharp. She turned toward our parents, her voice climbing to a frantic, high-pitched frequency. "Fix this," Savannah demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the documents resting on the cooler. "Tell her she is lying. Tell her you still own the house." My mother, Linda, took a step backward, shaking her head. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a breathless sob escaped. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. "Fix it!" Savannah shrieked, stomping her foot on the dry grass. "I maxed out 4 credit cards this morning. I have an interior design team coming on Tuesday. I am broke. You said you had the money. You said the estate would clear the lines of credit. You bankrupted us." The admission hung in the humid Texas air. Savannah had spent years cultivating a persona of a self-made suburban elite, mocking my simple lifestyle and telling anyone who would listen that she was the true success story of the family. Hearing her confess to total insolvency in front of the neighborhood association friends she had invited to witness my humiliation was a poetic turn of events. Her carefully manicured image crumbled in front of an audience of 100 people. She paced back and forth across the dry grass, her breathing erratic. The neighbors she had invited, the ones she spent months trying to impress, were now whispering to each other and edging toward the driveway. Savannah realized she would never be able to show her face at the country club again. The social currency she valued above all else had evaporated in a matter of seconds. In her frantic tantrum, she ripped the designer sunglasses off the top of her head. Her hands were shaking so severely that the expensive frames slipped through her fingers. The sunglasses tumbled to the ground, landing in the dry dirt near the edge of the barbecue pit. Savannah did not even notice. She took another angry step toward our father, bringing her heel down directly onto the lenses. The crisp sound of shattering glass and snapping plastic echoed across the patio. It was a visceral symbol of her ruined facade, ground into the dirt under her own weight. While Savannah continued to berate our parents, Uncle Vance recognized the gravity of his own predicament. He was a survivor who had spent decades charming his way out of bad business deals and talking lenders into risky extensions. He assessed the scene, taking in the presence of Attorney Caldwell and the undeniable validity of the deeds I had placed on the table. Vance realized that bluster and intimidation would no longer work on the niece he had just tried to destroy. He needed to pivot. He forced a wide, jovial smile onto his sweating face. The expression looked unnatural and strained, pulling at the corners of his mouth. He let out a loud, booming laugh, attempting to dismiss the past 5 minutes as a simple misunderstanding. "Genevieve." He chuckled, spreading his arms wide, as if preparing to welcome a long-lost friend. "You really had us going there. I have to admit, this is one hell of a prank. Silas always did have a twisted sense of humor, and you played your part perfectly. You proved your point, kiddo. You are a real player in the game now. Come here and give your uncle a hug. We have a lot of business to discuss." He stepped toward me, projecting the false warmth of a seasoned salesman closing a difficult deal. He thought he could erase 5 years of targeted cruelty with a single embrace. He believed my newfound wealth meant I was finally worthy of his respect, and that I would eagerly accept a seat at his table. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took one calculated step backward, ensuring a clear physical boundary remained between us. I reached into the interior pocket of my leather portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of watermarked paper. It was not a grand gesture, it was a routine administrative action. I am not interested in your embrace, Uncle Vance, I said, keeping my tone even and clinical. I am interested in property management. I extended my hand, offering him the document. Vance stopped in his tracks, his fake smile faltering. He slowly reached out and took the paper. His eyes scanned the crisp typed lines. As the new legal owner of the land beneath your commercial retail plazas, I am exercising my right to adjust the terms of your ground lease, I explained, watching the last traces of hope vanish from his eyes. That is a standard 30-day legal notice. I am raising the rent on all your commercial lots by 400%. Vance let out a shallow, ragged breath. He looked from the document to my face, trying to find a hint of mercy or hesitation. He found nothing but cold data. The heavy gold watch on his wrist caught the afternoon sun, but it looked cheap and meaningless now. He had spent his life projecting strength through expensive accessories and loud declarations. Without his land and his leases, he was just an aging man standing in a dusty yard, holding a piece of paper he could not afford. The reality of his situation stripped away years of practiced charm, leaving only raw panic. "You cannot do this," he whispered, his voice stripped of all its former power. "A 400% increase will drain my operating budget in a week. I will not be able to cover the bridge loans. The banks will seize my business. You are ruining me." "I am simply adjusting the market rate to reflect the true value of the land," I replied. "You taught me that business is business and a bet is a bet. I suggest you read the fine print before you sign any more high-interest loans." The realization of his impending bankruptcy hit Vance with full force. His knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to grip the edge of the cedar picnic table for support. The man who had commanded the yard just moments ago was now a broken shell, grasping a piece of paper that sealed his financial demise. The fragile hierarchy of the Mercer family imploded. The united front they had maintained to execute their cruel wager turned inward. The yard devolved into a chaotic shouting match. Savannah screamed at our mother, blaming her for not securing the deed to the suburban house. Linda fired back, reminding Savannah of the endless shopping sprees and the luxury vehicles they had funded. Linda wrung her hands together, her wide-brimmed sun hat knocked askew during the argument. She looked at the giant novelty checks still standing on the easel, a cruel reminder of the trap they had eagerly walked into. They had bet on my failure with such certainty that they never bothered to secure their own safety nets. Vance turned his fury toward my father. He pointed a trembling finger at Thomas, accusing him of knowing about the trust and failing to warn the family. My father shouted right back, defending himself and blaming Vance for initiating the public bet in the first place. Cousins grabbed their children and backed away from the staging area, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The loud, boastful clan that had always prided itself on presenting a flawless image to the world was tearing itself apart on the lawn. I stood beside Attorney Caldwell, watching the destruction unfold. Silas was right. Their foundations were rotten. I had merely removed the final support beam and let gravity do the rest. The shouting eventually died down, replaced by the heavy sound of ragged breathing and quiet sobs. The remaining guests stared at the ground, uncomfortable with the raw display of family ruin. My father Thomas separated himself from the arguing group. He looked older than his years, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He walked slowly toward me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his slacks. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over his lower lids and tracking down his weathered face. He stopped a few feet away, looking up at me with an expression of profound sorrow. He was attempting to play his final card. He knew he possessed no legal leverage and no financial power. The only currency he had left was paternal guilt. He believed the bond of blood would override the years of neglect. "Genevieve," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "please listen to me. You cannot do this. We are your family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head and food on your table. You cannot just throw your own mother and father out onto the street. We made mistakes, but we are still your parents." The tension in the yard became razor sharp. Every eye locked onto me, waiting to see if the daughter who had endured years of silent erasure would finally cave to the emotional manipulation of her father. The heat radiated off the dry earth, matching the intensity of his plea. I looked at the tears streaming down his face, and I recognized them for what they were. They were not tears of regret for how he had treated me. They were tears of terror for what he was about to lose. I held his gaze, allowing the silence to stretch, preparing to deliver the final severance. Thomas stood before me, his shoulders shaking, his face slick with a mixture of tears and perspiration. He expected a dramatic confrontation. He anticipated a loud shouting match where he could play the victim, deploy paternal authority, and beg for a comfortable compromise. My father wanted the familiar dynamic to return, the old routine, where I eventually yielded to his demands to restore domestic harmony. I denied him that comfort. I felt no urge to scream or hurl insults. I felt a profound, chilling emptiness. I looked at the man who had provided my genetic material and saw nothing but a panicked stranger standing in a dusty yard. "I am not doing anything to you, Dad," I stated, my voice carrying a flat, terrifying indifference. "I am not punishing you. I am simply enforcing the boundaries you built." The words struck him like a physical blow. He recoiled, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a rebuttal that did not exist. I kept my posture rigid, refusing to shrink or soften the impact of my declaration. I maintained eye contact, letting the cold reality of my statement freeze the air between us. "You spent 28 years erasing me to protect Savannah," I continued, ensuring every syllable landed with precise, calculated weight. "You sacrificed my dignity to fund her illusions. You decided I was not worth your investment because my path did not bring you immediate social glory. You treated me like a ghost in your own home, prioritizing country club aesthetics over your own child. Now I am agreeing to the terms you established. I am accepting the role you assigned me. I am remaining erased from your lives. I am no longer your daughter. I am your creditor." My mother pushed past Thomas, her wide-brimmed sun hat discarded somewhere in the dry grass. Linda reached out, her hands trembling, grasping at the empty space between us. She abandoned her refined persona, adopting the frantic, pleading tone of a cornered animal, desperate to escape a snare. "Genevieve, please listen to reason," Linda begged, hot tears carving uneven tracks through her flawless makeup. "We are blood. We are family. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood over money. We made poor choices, but we love you. We are family." I studied her desperate expression, recognizing the ultimate hypocrisy of her plea. She invoked the concept of kinship only when she required a human shield to absorb the consequences of her own greed. I remembered Grandpa Silas sitting in his dusty workshop, carving wood with steady, calloused hands, teaching me the true definition of loyalty. His wisdom provided the exact response required to sever the final tie. "Family builds mom," I replied, echoing the quiet logic of the only man who ever truly cared for my well-being. "Family creates a solid foundation. You only borrowed. You borrowed against your own future, and you borrowed against my self-worth. You spent decades extracting wealth from the banks, taking from Savannah's fragile ego, and stealing from my silent endurance. There is nothing left to extract. The accounts are empty." Linda collapsed inward, covering her face with her hands, letting out a harsh, jagged sob. The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably, averting their eyes from the raw display of domestic ruin. The grand spectacle they had anticipated had morphed into an autopsy of a failed lineage. The entertainment value had vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling dread. I turned my attention away from my weeping parents and focused on the cedar picnic table. Resting near the edge of the wood was the heavy glass jar containing the $10,000 wager. The faded $100 bills pressed against the glass, creating a physical manifestation of their arrogance. They worshipped that currency. They believed those paper notes held the power to dictate human value, to measure success, and to define failure. Uncle Vance had paraded that jar around as a weapon of ultimate humiliation, intending to break my spirit with a pile of cash. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the thick rim of the glass jar. The weight of it felt substantial in my grip. Savannah stopped weeping long enough to watch me, assuming I was finally claiming my prize. Vance stared with hollow eyes, expecting me to walk away clutching their money in a display of triumphant greed. They braced themselves for my final gloating victory lap, assuming my motivations mirrored their own shallow desires. I did not look at them. I pivoted on my heel and walked away from the staging area carrying the jar of cash. I bypassed the cluster of shocked relatives navigating toward the perimeter of the patio, where a large commercial smoker pit billowed fragrant mesquite smoke into the afternoon sky. A team of hired catering staff stood behind a row of stainless steel chafing dishes. They wore matching black aprons over crisp white shirts, their faces frozen in stunned silence, having witnessed the wealthy family self-destruct over the past 20 minutes. I approached the lead server, a young man holding a pair of silver tongs. He blinked in surprise, taking a hesitant step backward as I stopped in front of his workstation. I lifted the heavy glass jar and set it down on the stainless steel counter next to a tray of sliced brisket. The glass clinked sharply against the metal surface. "You have all worked incredibly hard today," I told the catering crew, keeping my tone polite and respectful. Dealing with this specific crowd requires an immense amount of patience. Please split this tip among your team. You earned it. The young server stared at the $10,000 in cash, his jaw going slack. He looked from the jar to my face, unable to comprehend the casual transfer of such a staggering sum. He opened his mouth to thank me, but no sound emerged. The collective gasp from my relatives echoed across the lawn. The gesture sliced deeper than any insult or legal threat. By casually giving away the very prize they had worshipped, I permanently devalued their entire existence. I demonstrated that their ultimate treasure, the sum they used to measure my worth, was nothing more than loose change to me. It was petty cash handed off to strangers for serving potato salad. Savannah let out a strangled cry, sinking to her knees in the dirt, her designer dress absorbing the dust. Vance buried his face in his hands, realizing he was ruined by a woman who could discard $10,000 without a second thought. I turned my back on the staging area, leaving the jar and the legacy of their bet behind. Attorney Caldwell stood near the edge of the patio, snapping the brass latches of his briefcase shut. He gathered the remaining legal notices, tucking them securely inside his leather folio. He offered me a single approving nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of the final strategy. We walked together, traversing the dry grass, moving away from the epicenter of the collapse. Behind me, the fragile piece of the Mercer family disintegrated entirely. The yard erupted into a cacophony of desperate screaming and bitter accusations. Savannah shrieked at Linda, blaming her for the impending foreclosure. Thomas yelled at Vance, cursing him for initiating the public wager that brought the wrath of Silas down upon their heads. Vance roared back, defending his terrible business acumen while mourning the loss of his commercial empire. Their voices tangled together in the humid air, a toxic symphony of ruined people turning on one another to survive. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not break my stride. I focused my gaze on the horizon, walking toward the back edge of the parking pasture, where my armored black vehicle waited in the shade of a sprawling oak tree. The heavy Texas heat felt different now. It no longer pressed down on my shoulders. It felt warm and liberating, burning away the last remnants of my old life. Caldwell opened the passenger door and slid into his seat, placing the leather briefcase on his lap. I climbed behind the steering wheel, pressing the ignition button. The powerful engine roared to life with a deep, resonant purr vibrating through the reinforced chassis. The climate control system engaged immediately, pushing a wave of crisp, cool air into the cabin, sealing us off from the sweltering humidity and the toxic noise outside. I shifted the transmission into drive and pressed my foot against the accelerator. The heavy tires rolled forward, gripping the earth. The satisfying sound of thick rubber crunching against the white limestone gravel filled the cabin of the vehicle. I steered the car down the winding driveway, kicking up a dense cloud of dust that drifted toward the fighting relatives. I drove through the wrought iron gates, leaving the sprawling ranch behind without a single ounce of regret. I left them standing in the ruins of their own making, trapped in a prison, constructed from their arrogance and sealed by my silence. The road ahead stretched out long and clear, leading back to the city I was quietly building brick by brick. 6 months passed, bringing the brief, mild Texas winter, and then the sudden, vibrant explosion of spring. The oppressive heat that choked the day of the barbecue faded into crisp mornings and cool evenings. The landscape shifted, and so did the reality of the people who used to dictate my life. I did not need to hire private investigators to learn what happened to my relatives. In the tightly knit circles of Austin real estate and suburban gossip, the truth always found a way to surface. The natural consequences of their arrogance unfolded with a slow, devastating certainty. Uncle Vance no longer held court in expansive boardrooms or sprawled across pristine cattle ranches. When the 30-day notice on his ground lease expired, he could not secure the capital to pay the 400% rent increase. His lenders panicked. The high-interest bridge loans he signed collapsed his operating budget within weeks. The banks seized his vehicles, his properties, and his reputation. Today, Vance operates his severely diminished business out of a tiny, poorly ventilated office located in a decaying strip mall on the far eastern edge of the city. The neon sign above his door flickers and buzzes constantly, shorting out every few days. The parking lot is riddled with deep potholes and overgrown weeds. He spends his days arguing with discount suppliers and dodging collection calls from angry creditors. He wears the same faded suits, but they hang loosely on his frame, now stripped of the bloated confidence that used to fill them. The man who once bragged about owning the horizon is now trapped in a windowless room smelling of cheap carpet glue and failure. My parents suffered a similarly poetic fate. When the foreclosure proceedings began on their sprawling suburban home, they scrambled to find a lifeline. There was no secret account and no hidden savior to bail them out. They were forced to sell the property at a significant loss just to satisfy the debt they had secretly accumulated. The remaining funds evaporated instantly, swallowed by the staggering credit card bills Savannah had racked up. Stripped of her golden child status and her pristine house, Savannah had to declare bankruptcy. The luxury vehicles were repossessed. The designer wardrobes were sold off piece by piece to cover basic living expenses. Without a home of their own, my parents and my sister moved into a modest, cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment situated right next to a busy commercial highway. The irony of their living situation was profound and inescapable. They had spent 5 years mocking my small apartment, placing a $10,000 bet that I would spend my entire life as a renter. Now they wake up every morning to the sound of semi-trucks rattling their thin drywall. They share a single bathroom and park their used cars in a shared lot. They are living the exact destiny they had so cruelly projected onto me. I do not feel the urge to drive past their building or gloat over their misery. I simply let the silence remain unbroken. I channeled all my focus and energy into the legacy my grandfather Silas left behind. I did not want to hoard the land he spent his life protecting. I wanted to transform it into something meaningful. On a bright Tuesday morning, I stood on a sprawling 10-acre plot of prime Austin real estate, wearing heavy leather work boots and a yellow hard hat. The site used to be an empty dirt field where Vance planned to build another soulless retail plaza. Instead, a team of contractors and architects were pouring the foundation for the Silas Mercer Innovation Center. It is an expansive state-of-the-art technology hub and community campus designed to serve the city. The blueprints feature walls of sustainable glass-open concept server rooms and broad outdoor green spaces. But the true value of the facility lies in its purpose. The center is fully funded by Lone Star Analytics and provides free, comprehensive coding boot camps for underprivileged young women. I built a place where girls who cannot afford expensive university degrees can learn artificial intelligence, data science, and machine learning. We provide them with high-end laptops, professional mentorship, and a safe environment to build their futures. They will never have to listen to arrogant men tell them that their work is not real. They will learn how to write the code that runs the world. The physical embodiment of the philosophy my grandfather taught me is rising from the Texas dirt. We are building instead of talking. I returned to my corporate headquarters later that afternoon, taking the private elevator up to the 22nd floor. The sun dipped low over the Austin skyline, casting long golden rays through my floor-to-ceiling windows. The office was quiet, humming with the gentle sound of high-powered servers processing data in the background. I walked over to my desk and looked at the dark walnut box resting on the polished glass surface. The heavy brass padlock and the rusted iron key were gone, stored away in a secure vault. The wooden lid remained open. The interior of the box no longer held thick stacks of foreclosure notices or predatory property deeds. Instead, the box held a simple ceramic vase filled with a fresh bouquet of Texas bluebonnets. The vibrant blue and white petals caught the evening light, softening the sharp, modern edges of my corporate suite. The flowers were a quiet tribute to the rancher who taught me how to dig a fence post and how to outsmart the loudest people in the room. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, resting my hands on the cool glass of my desk. I looked at the bluebonnets and reflected on the journey of the past 5 years. I learned that true wealth does not announce itself with flashy belt buckles or oversized novelty checks. True wealth is silent. It operates in the background, calculating and preparing and securing the foundation before the storm ever hits. I also learned the true definition of power. Power is not the ability to crush your enemies or force people to apologize. True power is the profound ability to simply walk away. It is the freedom to look at a table full of toxic people who refuse to value you and decide that you no longer want a seat. I want to speak directly to you now as the sun sets and the screen fades. If you are sitting at a table where your worth is constantly a joke, stop trying to change the punchline. Just buy the table. Do not waste your energy trying to convince people to respect you. Use that energy to build an undeniable reality that forces them to live in your shadow. I know many of you watching have faced similar battles with people who were supposed to protect you. I want to hear your stories. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you had to enforce a brutal boundary with toxic family members. Tell me how you found the strength to walk away and build your own empire. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that the quietest people in the room are usually the ones holding the keys.
We often look at the pristine facades of American suburban homes, the perfectly manicured lawns, the gleaming two-car garages, the flawless holiday portraits that arrive in the mail every December, and we instinctively assume that behind those heavy varnished oak doors lies nothing but warmth, stability, and enduring love. But family tragedies rarely announce themselves with the dramatic shattering of glass or the loud wail of sirens. They begin much quieter, taking root in the silent, invisible spaces between people who share a last name but nothing else. They begin with a profound, almost silent misunderstanding of what life's true value actually is. When we strip away the cinematic drama of bitter estrangements, the spectacular financial takeovers, and the cold calculations of revenge, what remains is a stark, unforgiving lesson in human attachment. It is a story about the inescapable laws of cause and effect playing out in real time across generations. For parents navigating the relentless complexities of modern society, particularly within an American culture that so fiercely champions rugged individualism, aggressive ambition, and material success, the lines between genuine happiness and performative achievement have become dangerously blurred. We easily fall into the alluring, suffocating trap of fame and profit. Society teaches us to constantly measure, compare, and display our worth. In this environment, it is terrifyingly easy to get swept up in the whirlwind of social prestige, treating our children not as independent, sovereign souls, but as glittering ornaments designed to decorate and reinforce our own fragile egos. This is the profound blindness of the parental ego. We instinctively, sometimes unconsciously, favor the golden child who brings us immediate social validation, the one holding the prestigious university degree, the one moving seamlessly in powerful corporate circles, the one who guarantees approving nods at the country club. In doing so, we unwittingly erase and abandon the child who refuses or struggles to conform to those superficial expectations. Affection slowly morphs into something conditional, parceled out only when specific metrics are met. When love is measured by material value, earning potential, and superficial vanity, it fundamentally ceases to be love. It becomes a cold, calculated transaction. From a spiritual and ethical perspective, this desperate clinging to conditional pride breeds only deep, lingering suffering. It severs the sacred, unconditional connection that is supposed to be the very bedrock of a traditional family structure, leaving both parent and child stranded on separate islands of resentment. To break this generational cycle of hurt to stop the bleeding before it permanently damages the family tree, parents must completely reevaluate how they raise their children through 3 core lenses. The first of these is the cultivation of true wisdom, which requires a profound, piercing understanding of the child. Genuine wisdom does not involve teaching a child how to ruthlessly accumulate wealth or claw their way up a corporate ladder at the expense of their soul. Instead, it is the rare ability to see through the overwhelming noise of the world and recognize the true innate nature of each individual child. A truly wise parent understands that a child who is quiet, who learns at a slower pace, or who walks a highly unconventional lonely path is not a failure or a disappointment. Rather, that quietness is often the very soil where the most extraordinary enduring capabilities are quietly taking root. Wisdom allows parents to stop the toxic, endless cycle of comparison, to dismantle their own ingrained prejudices, and to realize that the greatest asset they can leave their children is not a multi-million-dollar trust fund, but the absolute freedom to be authentically themselves. The second lens is the nurturing of deep morality, which within the intimate walls of a home translates directly to unconditional compassion and fairness. It is the capacity to love your children fiercely and consistently, even when they stumble, even when they fall short of society's arbitrary benchmarks, and especially when they fail to bring a halo of glory to the family name. When parents are willing to sell out their own integrity, or when they cast aside their own flesh and blood simply to save face in front of neighbors, colleagues, and peers, they forfeit the most fundamental moral foundation of parenting. True affection is an act of grace that does not demand a return on investment. A family must be a safe, unconditional harbor from the harsh storms of the outside world, not a sterile courtroom where a child's fundamental worth is coldly calculated based on their income bracket or social utility. The third lens is the intentional forging of inner resilience and emotional strength. True grit and unwavering emotional stability are never born from excessive coddling, nor can they be bought with a pre-funded bank account or a network of elite connections. Resilience is forged exclusively in the crucible of quiet, unseen struggles. Instead of using overbearing parental authority to crush a child's spirit or forcefully mold their will to fit a predetermined, comfortable script, we must learn the agonizingly difficult art of stepping back. We must allow them the space to fall to fail and to build their own internal fortitude. The ability to endure hardship, to remain calm in the face of betrayal and adversity, and to stand firmly on one's own 2 feet is the most resilient kind of strength a human being can possess. It is the only real armor that will truly protect them when the devastating storms of life inevitably arrive at their door. But none of this wisdom, compassion, or resilience can be imparted to a child if it is not first lived by the parent. The core message of these fractured family tales is one of radical, unflinching self-correction. Before we attempt to mold the clay of our children's lives, we must first chisel away at the rough, jagged edges of our own souls. The wounds we inflict on our children are rarely born of pure intentional malice. They are almost always direct reflections of our own unhealed fears, our own deep-seated insecurities, and our own unquenchable greed for validation. The journey of self-correction is the agonizing necessary process of learning to let go of our vanity. It requires us to practice listening deeply without defense and having the sheer courage to admit our own catastrophic mistakes. Only when parents learn to lower their egos and dismantle their own pride can the family finally have the breathing room required for true understanding, fairness, and genuine connection to take root and bloom. These are the hard, uncomfortable truths we must face if we ever hope to heal the quiet fractures spreading through our own homes. If you find yourself drawn to these raw, unfiltered reflections on complex family dynamics, the hidden costs of pride and the quiet power of standing your ground when the world tells you to fold, I highly encourage you to follow our channel, Orange Vengeance. Here we share the compelling stories that happen behind closed doors, shedding light on the uncomfortable realities we all must navigate to find our true strength. As the sun sets on another day, casting long, stretching shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of our quiet neighborhoods, we are left to look at our own reflections in the glass. We turn the keys in our locks, step into our quiet, dimly lit hallways, and listen to the profound silence of the house. We build these sturdy walls to keep the dangerous world out, but so often we unwittingly trap our own unhealed ghosts inside. The legacy we leave our children is not written in the commercial properties we deed to them, the trusts we establish, or the money we leave in their bank accounts. It is written in the silence between our words. It is written in the way we look at them when they have nothing left to offer us but their raw, unfiltered selves. When you look at your family tonight, the question remains hanging in the quiet air. Are you truly looking at them with unconditional love, or are you just desperately searching for your own reflection?